Inflation.
Economic growth.
Unemployment.
Inflation.
Inflation. The economy is always changing, but over the last few years it has dramatically changed due to some reasons you might be able to guess.
Coronavirus.
Lockdown.
Coronavirus. War in Ukraine.
And you might be trying to figure out where all of this is going. Turns out that question is asked quite a bit, even without the possible collapse of the economy. One little thing you should already know. People want money. Two things actually. People don't want to not have money either. So you have investors and businesses trying to determine whether expenses like a new location or employees are going to generate value and whether they should spend their money on it. And you have households deciding whether they should spend on a new car or save that money instead. Then you have the Reserve Bank and government playing babysitter and pulling strings to make sure the economy remains stable and doesn't go south into a recession. But the economy is a complex system of billions of people making billions of decisions on whether they should spend their money. So isn't it ambitious to try to measure how successful it is, much less predict where it might go next? Well, that hasn't stopped people from trying. The need to somehow measure the economy and forecast where it is headed results in a range of measures for economic performance, with the most commonly used ones focusing on a separate but interconnected cog of the economy. Those economic indicators being the economic growth rate, the inflation rate, and the unemployment rate. But economists have been arguing that these gauges don't fully reflect how successful an economy is in improving the living standards of those who participate in it. And that is where alternatives like the Human Development Index comes in. The part I got assigned to explain by the rest of the team is the economic growth rate. Basically, it is the percentage change in a country's GDP over a period of time. The GDP itself tries to measure the performance of an economy by measuring something more concrete. The total value of goods and services produced in that economy over that period of time. That's the gist of what the term means, but the methods used to calculate it varies. Here in Australia, the Australian Bureau of Statistics measures GDP by taking the average of the GDP measured at 3 different points in a circular flow of income. The value of goods and services, the income generated by employees and firms, and the total spending of households, firms, the government, and the overseas sector to get a single dollar value, which is then plotted onto a graph. And the change in GDP as a percentage of the previous period's GDP is the economic growth rate. So if the GDP is constantly going up by 3% each quarter, the GDP graph looks like this. But the economic growth rate for that same time period will look like this. Close enough to what economists want. Stable growth of the economy hovering around 2 to 3% each quarter. But over the last 5 years, this is what the graph actually looks like. This line going up or down is always due to the same key factor, the amount of money being spent in an economy. Realistically, this could be explained using the total income of the economy or the value of the products produced. But I like to think that spending is where the cycle starts, as that is where people can make the choice to spend or not. Spending or expenditures can be split into different groups: consumer spending, government spending, firm spending, and net exports. The big thing that needs to be understood is that the spending of each group is connected. One group increasing their spending means another group earning more, and therefore likely to spend more, while the opposite is also true, creating a positive feedback loop. That initial increase or decrease in spending is always due to external factors, which no economy is free from. Especially in the context of a global economy, change is always expected. Over the last 5 years, the GDP growth rate has hovered around 0.5% each quarter up until 2020, which was when COVID arrived. In the second quarter of 2020, restrictions imposed by the government shut down non-essential activities and businesses. This immediately stopped millions of people from spending on things like eating out or traveling, preventing restaurants, hotels, and their employees from receiving an income, which stops that money from flowing to other businesses that those people normally spend on. Then more people who haven't been affected by this hear about it and begin to feel uncertain, so they decide to save in case they do get affected, reducing the revenue of more businesses. At the same time, restrictions around the world cancelled flights and delayed ships. The global supply chain was a mess. Factories shut down, manufacturing slowed, and now even big corporations are spending less. So people started getting laid off, and eventually the entire economy collapsed. No, this isn't what happened. The government knew that shutting these businesses down would hurt the economy, so they began spending on stimulus packages, which got sent across the country, offsetting the downturn in consumer and business spending. But the government couldn't possibly pay for the entire country's lost productivity. The Reserve Bank probably could though. Just joking. The RBA was created to maintain economic stability, and they have more tools than printing money to achieve that. What they were trying to do is get people to spend more. So they made getting money through a loan cheaper by reducing the interest rate that banks pay to one another, which eventually, emphasis on eventually here, gets passed on to consumers. And it worked. Investors and ordinary people started borrowing at incredibly cheap rates and putting that money into the economy. The mining industry in Australia have always buffered Australia against the economic disruptions in the rest of the world. This time around, it was impacted by supply chain issues and labor shortages, but commodities like iron ore still saw consistent demand. Across the Australian economy, the GDP contracted for 2 consecutive periods when it hit the trough of a negative 6.7% growth rate. But the collection of stimulus packages, cheap loans, and Australia's mining industry mitigated most of COVID-19's effects on the economy. And as restrictions began to ease and the economy began to stabilize, pent-up consumer demand increased spending, especially in leisure activities that had been postponed due to restrictions and financial uncertainties, like going out to the movies or traveling. The GDP rebounded, and by the fourth quarter of 2020, it had already returned to pre-pandemic levels. That spike in GDP growth eventually slowed, until the third quarter of 2021, where the GDP shrank by 2% due to the spread of the new Delta variant and the consequent lockdowns. The following quarter then saw a spike in GDP growth before returning back to the 0.5% that was common pre-pandemic, which is where we are now. But using GDP to measure if an economy is successful has problems. GDP only measures how much money is being passed through the economy, not where it came from or where it's going. Is an economy successful if an increase in GDP came at the cost of the climate crisis? Does it improve people's lives if the majority of GDP is being concentrated more and more at the top 1%? The economy in the last 5 years has been through a lot. That's what the data shows. But economic indicators are just a tool to help people decide what to do with the money. Real economic success can only be told through human stories of every participant.